did a librarian like me become interested in researching and baking sweet dishes from the past centuries? When I took up the post of librarian at Oriel College, Oxford, my dual interests of librarianship and baking came together. Amongst a large number of volumes which an alumnus had bequeathed to Oriel Library from his country house in Yorkshire, I discovered a small book entitled the Otterington Hall Recipe Book, compiled from family recipes, and realized that it might be possible to recreate the kind of happy atmosphere described in the book by baking and serving some of these sweet dishes in college. I circulated some of the recipes to members of the college, and to my delight, many of them contributed baked goods made in their own kitchens. The event was named an edible exhibition, and the experiment was a great success, attended by the college community and friends around Oxford. As a result, I was encouraged to hold more of these edible exhibitions. As I had some knowledge of Middle English, I decided to translate recipes from various sources written in past centuries. I soon found that it was one thing to translate them, but quite another to make them work. There were no lists of ingredients, the measurements were basic, temperatures were not included, quantities not often specified, and timing was vague. The first recipe I attempted to make was Pain Ragoon, a honey and pine nut sweet, which some of you will have enjoyed today, from a 14th century manuscript. Here is the original recipe with an example of the sweets beside it. On reading it over, I saw that it involved heating sugar and honey together, but the only instructions relating to temperature were with easy fire and keep it well for burning. I took easy fire to mean on a low heat so that I could keep the mixture from burning in the pan. The next part of the recipe resembled instructions that my mother had given me when I was a young girl learning to make toffee. The words were, "And when it hath be boiled a while, take up a drop thereof with thy finger," I wouldn't recommend that, "and do it in a little water, and look if it hong together." While I was reading this, it dawned on me that it was the soft ball test for boiled sugar, in which you drop a small quantity of the mixture into cold water to see if it's ready. This gave me confidence that I was working along the right lines and that I might be able to understand the instructions more easily than I'd thought at first. One of the things that I learned from this first experiment was that modern recipes have their roots in these old recipes of the past. The edible exhibitions provided an opportunity for people to share in the making of the dishes as well as sampling them, teaching everyone how the food of earlier times would have tasted, and more importantly, how the particular combination of flavors would work in practice. One of the earliest sweet treats was Lombardy custard. The word custard originally came from croustade, the crust of the tart. Dried fruits such as apple were plentiful in Britain and were used to brighten up dishes and add flavor. Exotic fruits such as dates, figs, raisins, and currants were imported from the Orient or Spain, as were spices such as pepper, sugar, ginger, and the most expensive spice of all, saffron. Recipes have been important from the beginning of civilization, and many of the recipes passed down through families and recorded in earlier ages were medicinal preparations like this one. The word that we pronounce as recipe was the imperative of the Latin verb recipere, which meant take. It was often abbreviated to a letter R with a small bar through it, as in the second line down here. commonly called RX, a symbol that still sometimes appears on modern prescription forms. The earliest cookbook that has been found up to now is the Form of Curry, which means method of cooking. It was written in 1390. During the 15th century, printed books started to appear in the vernacular language of the area rather than only in Latin and Greek. The first printed English recipe book was not made till 1500, so English cooks would still have been working from written manuscript copies of their recipes for everyday use, if indeed they needed written recipes at all. One such manuscript is preserved in Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and here are two recipes from it. One for yellow darioles, small custard tarts, and the other for stuffed bread or rastons, which are pictured beside the recipes. One type of book that was very popular in the 15th and 16th centuries was the Herbal, in which herbalists explored the medicinal properties of plants. Contemporary recipe writers wanted the ingredients in their food to benefit those eating it, so they relied on the herbals to give them advice. I baked a tart of borage flowers from a proper new book of cookery from 1557 and found in the Parker Library of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. In his famous Herbal, Gerard says this about borage: those of our time do use the flowers to exhilarate and make the mind glad, and the tart does make a refreshing dessert. Medieval banquets were usually accompanied by a large decorative sugar creation called a subtlety, because it represented something other than it was. The subtlety that I made for this 16th century edible exhibition represented the Oriel buildings in the 16th century as drawn by John Beerblock. The drawing, now in the Bodleian, formed part of a book about Oxford made to present to Elizabeth I on her visit in August 1566. As the 17th century progressed, women started to write and publish domestic manuals and recipe books as well as men. Composing recipes was seen as an appropriate extension of household responsibilities, and so it was an acceptable form of writing for women when other avenues were closed. In the early 18th century, Ralph Ayres, the head chef of New College, wrote a small cookery book of which 5 handwritten copies are known to exist. The recipes were for dishes that would have been served to the members of New College at the time, and I couldn't resist baking his recipe for little suet puddings called New College puddings. A printed edition of his book was published in 1922, and according to the foreword, the recipe writer Mrs. Hannah Glass had included recipes from it in her own cookbook, published later in the century, with smaller quantities given for family use. In the 19th century, cooks like Eliza Acton and Mrs. Beeton held sway and made elegant delights such as meringues. For the centerpiece of the 19th century edible exhibition, I decided to make meringue Oriel, a model of Oriel College's first quad. This was presented at the edible exhibition and later divided so that members of Oriel could eat their own rooms. The edible exhibitions were certainly valuable from a culinary point of view, but they also provided a social focus, bringing many people together from different parts of Oxford society who may never have met otherwise. Sweet Slices of History is the story of how I located and chose the recipes I did, from the 14th century court and the halls of Oxford to the country house kitchens and of the 19th and early 20th centuries, all brought to life as sweet feasts on today's table. Thank you. I'll just tell you about why I've chosen these pages of these books here. This is a Herball, Gerard's Herball, and it explains that in his day there was made a certain bread or cakes called gingerbread, which is very good against the cough and all the infirmities of the lungs, which is cast into molds, some of one fashion and some another, according to the fancy of the apothecaries, as the pictures here do show. Now, this was interesting because it was a direct link to gingerbread being used as a medicinal ingredient. And that's why we find so many recipes for gingerbread and also marzipan, because it was also lauded as being a wonderful remedy for all sorts of things. So this is this page. This book is the manuscript of the New College recipe book by Ralph Ayres, and I've put it at the page to make a dish of New College puddings, which I did make for the New College staff, so they know they're all right. So you can have a look at these.
Thank you, Marjorie. Somebody once said to me, never eat anything bigger than your own head.
Yes.